2015 monthly BCM webinar. Lovely to see so many of you tuning in from around North America. Folks from Virginia, San Diego, Indiana, Niagara, Philadelphia, Toronto, San Francisco, Minneapolis, Duluth, and those are just the ones I recognize. So welcome, friends. Thanks so much for being with us. Tonight it's summertime and we're gonna be kind of relaxed. We're relaxed here in the BCM studio where I have with me Erynn Smith and Humel, who you'll meet in just a few minutes. And we're gonna be a little informal tonight. This is a theme. Tonight's theme is one that we've been working with here for more than 15 years. This will be the third webinar we've done more or less on this subject. That is the subject of the way in which the ancient story of the Tower of Babel and the New Testament story of Acts and Pentecost, how they inform one another, how they were reflections on the ancient world in which they arose and what they mean for us today. This is such, these archetypal stories are so important in our mind that they really represent virtually the core catechism from our perspective of radical discipleship. It's really important that we understand these stories. Now, over the years, in 2012, I believe it was, we looked at these stories, particularly in terms of how they articulate a multicultural vision for society, both ancient and modern. And we focused a lot on the deep and hidden multicultural history of California and North America in general, and looked at the way in which the Babel and Pentecost story affirm social diversity, social polyculture. Last year, around this time, we looked at these stories again, and in particular looked at how they, the role that language plays in both stories, both the Genesis 11 and the Acts 2 story. And we looked at the way in which language and linguistic diversity is a barometer of social diversity, both in antiquity and in the present. Tonight, we're going to look at these same texts again, and this time explore the question of monoculture and polyculture through the lens of agricultural practices. And to get us moving in that direction, about 10 days ago, I was in Claremont down in Southern California at a big ecological civilization conference, and I got to meet one of my heroes. Vandana Shiva is someone I think probably known to all of you on the webinar. If not, Google her. She's really one of the political and social heroes of our time. She's been working for decades as a champion of local culture, sustainable culture, indigenous farming culture, sustainability in the face of giant corporate interests. She was at this conference, and I finally got to meet her and shake her hand and tell her how much her work has meant to me and to all the folks that we work with. Dr. Shiva is someone who is perhaps the most articulate spokesperson in terms of the kinds of issues, contemporary issues, we are trying to get at tonight. This is a quote from an article that she wrote a couple of years ago. She says, "The monoculture of the mind," this is a phrase that she coined more than 20 years ago, "treats diversity as disease and creates coercive structures to remodel our biologically and culturally diverse world on the concepts of one privileged class, one race, one gender of a single species. As this monoculture of the mind, this is her trope obviously for colonialism and capitalism, as this took over, biodiversity disappeared from our farms and our food. It's the destruction of biodiverse rich cultivation and diets that has led to the malnutrition crisis. Now this she was talking about in terms of one of her recent struggles in India, where Bill Gates and company are trying to move in to monocrop bananas in order to solve the iron crisis, the iron nutritional crisis among poor people in the third world. Vandana Shiva points out that what they're proposing to do is to raise all sorts of native indigenous iron-rich plants that have traditionally been grown in India for years in order to monocrop bananas and then sell them back to people so that they can get their iron. So they're going to eradicate indigenous iron supplies and nutrients in order to do industrial agriculture. And this is the kinds of battles that Dr. Shiva has been fighting for many, many years, as you all know. This book, Monocultures of the Mind, appeared in 1993, so more than 20 years ago. And it really is the book, I think, that put Vandana Shiva on the map in many ways. I mean, think about what you were doing back in 1993. This woman was really pushing out the boundaries of this critique. And it's an amazing book. I really recommend it highly. The kinds of things that she argues in this book is things such as this quote: "The Western systems of knowledge have generally been viewed as universal. However, the dominant system is itself only a local system with its social basis in particular culture, class, and gender. It's not universal in any epistemological sense. It's merely," and this is the key phrase here, "it's merely the globalized version of a local and parochial tradition. Emerging from a dominating and colonizing culture, however, modern knowledge systems are themselves colonizing." The very important point that Shiva is making here is she's making a distinction between universal knowledge and globalized knowledge. Globalized knowledge in this case is just a colonizing culture that's become global, but it's not universal in any true sense. It's just globalized. This is a very important concept that we'll come back to at the end of this webinar in our conversation. But she goes on to to say, you know, genuine universal ideas would be defined in terms of openness to all cultures. The globalizing local, however, that's what she calls the colonizing knowledge of North Atlantic Western culture, spreads by violence and misrepresentation. And the first level of violence unleashed on local systems of knowledge is to make them invisible, to see them not as knowledge, certainly not as scientific knowledge at all. This invisibility is the first reason why local systems collapse without trial and test when confronted with this dominating paradigm of the West. Now, it's important for us to understand that Dr. Shiva herself is a trained scientist. You might not know that she started out originally working in India's nuclear program. So her critique of the false universality of Western science is particularly trenchant. And I just think that her way of framing the issue of monoculture versus polyculture is very, very important for our conversation tonight. She says, among other things, the prefix scientific for modern knowledge and unscientific for traditional local knowledge systems has less to do with empirical knowledge and more to do with the power of domination. Nevertheless, we really all grew up in a cultural system that simply assumed the cognitive superiority of the Western scientific view, and saw science as the truly open method of inquiry, and saw local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, as essentially closed systems. It turns out that that's exactly the opposite of the case, that the scientific paradigm has been almost fascist in its claims to the only singular truth, and local indigenous knowledges have been disappeared right and left. So a couple of years ago we talked about social diversity. Last year we talked about linguistic diversity. We're sort of deepening and broadening this analysis now to talk about diversity and polyculture in the true anthropological sense of that term. Now, Shiva, more than any other analogy, tends to try to describe this dilemma through the lens of agriculture, because that's really the terrain of her struggle in India and around the world. So look at this, this quote. Dominant scientific knowledge breeds a monoculture of the mind by making space for local alternatives to disappear. Very much like monocultures of introduced plant varieties lead to the displacement and destruction of local diversity, right? So she's making this analogy between cultural imperialism and agricultural monoculture, industrial agriculture. Dominant knowledge, she says, destroys the very conditions for these alternatives to exist. Very much like the introduction of monocultures destroy the conditions for diverse species to exist. In other words, monoculture and polyculture really can't and don't coexist, not in the same space, not agriculturally and not politically or socially or linguistically. So these are some of the issues that we want to get at in tonight's webinar. This version of our Pentecost webinar is going to see how the biblical texts illumine agricultural practices large and small. And to help us think through that are going to be guests from our bioregion here with local knowledge. I just want to briefly introduce you to the two folks who are going to speak in a few minutes. One is our very own neighbor and colleague Erynn Smith of the Abundant Table Farm Project right here in Ventura County, an organic alternative to industrial agriculture on the Oxnard Plain. And she is joined by another neighbor the other way down the road, and also a farmer and gardener and permaculturist here in Ventura County, Erynn Humel, who works with Community Roots Garden in Oxnard. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of them. They'll be sitting in the seat next to me in a few minutes. But in order to lay the context, as we always do in this catechism, let's just have a brief review of the biblical narrative that turns out to be an ancient story that can enable us in modern times to resist the culture of monoculture and help animate and retrieve and rehabilitate polyculture. So there's Erynn. I'm working two screens at once, and there's Eric. So I might get a little confused sometimes. So to our Bible study. These are our two texts, Genesis 11 and Acts 2. If you have a Bible handy and want to open them up, we'll kind of go through them pretty quickly. We'll start with Genesis. It's one of the oldest stories in our Bible. In order to make sense of it, we need to review some deep history using a very broad brush. And so what I want to emphasize at start is that in the beginning was polyculture. That's true both of plant and species, diversity, as beautifully outlined in Genesis chapter 1. It's also true in terms of human beings. What we know of human beings on the planet, for most of the time that human beings have walked the planet, have lived in small, local, indigenous, bioregionally appropriate, and sustainable clan and tribal cultures. That is by far the majority tradition of human beings on the planet, whether we think that's been for 50,000 years or 2 million years. And what we also know is around 10,000 before the Common Era, so about 12,000 years ago, there were the beginnings of the domestication, first of plants, and then of animals, and finally of people. That was a process that took 5,000 to 7,000 years. But as a result of that process, human populations began to concentrate and grow, and social organization began to be more complicated and more hierarchical. The level of violence between tribes, and particularly by dominant groups over other groups, began to grow. And by around the year 5000 of the Common Era, we begin to see the rise of regional empires. What we know in the Western historical narrative as the beginning of civilization. But already this narrative understands civilization to be an improvement, an evolution upwards into complexity and hierarchy and militarization and imperial social forms. The Bible tells a different story, but what we know is that of all the places that this process happened, and it happened independently all around the world, it happened in South America, it happened in Central America, it happened in India and China, but we know that it happened first in Mesopotamia. And that makes the old Bible stories particularly poignant, because the Semitic tribes that began to feel the brunt of colonization by these early empires had front row seats on this historical process. And that's why it makes sense to turn to the biblical narrative to see its sort of archetypal narrative of this, what we in the West call the rise of civilization. The Bible actually sees it as a progressive fall. So as we well know, the Genesis story begins with a portrait of human life in a world that is called a garden that human beings have a vocation to serve and preserve, and in which they live in symbiotic relationship with the spirit world, with each other, and with all the critters and plants, known archetypally as the Garden of Eden. Now, the next step in the Genesis story, of course, is that something goes wrong. Human beings do not think that the good creation as given by Creator is good enough, and begin to try to seize power and knowledge to re-engineer creation to make it better. That is, to make it better for human beings exclusively. So that is the story that's told in Genesis chapter 3, the fall of the first human beings, Adam and Chava, the man made from topsoil and the woman made from the man, the body of the man in that ancient story. And as a result of this fall, they are exiled from the garden. So here's an old tale of disintegration of the original symbiosis. There are interesting touch points in this narrative to what we know of the so-called rise of civilization. One being that once the human beings are exiled from the garden, they now have to sweat to cultivate the soil. The soil is not as hospitable as it was originally. This could be seen as an ancient memory of the way in which local horticulture was forced to give way to imperial agriculture, which we know was colonizing the planet hand in hand with the early empires. Now, this is not just my harebrained reading of the Bible and antiquity. There are other anthropologists, historians, biblical scholars who read the story this way. Two of the most popular are Daniel Quinn in his well-known Ishmael series, and the Jewish literary theorist Evan Eisenberg in a great book called The Ecology of Eden. Many others have looked at this interesting parallel between the primeval narrative of Genesis 1 to 11 and what we know about ancient rise of civilization. Now, this fall story in the Bible sort of goes through 7 major stages of deterioration. As mentioned, the first aspect of that is alienation from the earth. Famously, the lament of Cain, that the soil is cursed for him. The second stage is the rise of interspecies violence, or what we could call fratricide. That's the well-known story of Cain and Abel. It's very interesting in this story that the villain in this story is the farmer. And that seems to cohere with what we know of the aggressive farming civilization of empires that kept colonizing more and more indigenous people, first in Mesopotamia, spreading out into the region we know as Palestine today. So Daniel Quinn and Evan Eisenberg both agree that the Cain and Abel story is an old warning tale about the aggressive and ultimately lethal farming culture that colonized antiquity, replacing local knowledge with imperial knowledge. The third iteration of this story is the rise of urban concentrations of power, which we know began probably somewhere in the region of Turkey around 5000 BCE. The city of Jericho, so famous in the biblical account, dates back to at least 3000 BCE. These cities were the flagships of early imperial civilizations. And that is what we're told immediately on the outside of the garden. Cain, the murderer, builds a city and names it after his son. And the name of the city means to re-engineer the world. So these are very powerful archetypes. This is followed by the spread of violence. Look here how the city of Enoch, or to recreate the world, the progeny of that project is Lamech, who says that he is going to avenge anyone who crosses his path 77-fold. So you have the beginnings of the spiral of violence that seems to be emanating out of the ancient urban centers. Keep in mind, these are peasant folk tales that are being preserved by the very tribes that are being displaced and disappeared by this ever-growing, powerful urban civilization. The fifth iteration in the Genesis primeval narrative is the ascent of warrior classes, the people who are called the Nephilim, who are bigger than life. We see them reappear a number of times in the biblical story, such as Joshua 13, when the Israelites look in on Canaan and they see people who were bigger than life, and the Israelites, the Hebrews, felt like grasshoppers before them. You also get this in the archetypal story of Goliath and David, the bigger than life professional warrior who serves the interests of empire. So you see the story after archetypal story in the primeval narrative of the rise of what we call civilization. At that point in Genesis 6, the Creator tries to pull the plug, feeling like the whole experiment has gone haywire. grieving at the way things are turning out. This destruction through the flood has a sort of a lifeboat counter-narrative of redemption in the famous story of Noah, who becomes the ark for all of life. However, when creation is rebooted in Genesis 9, very quickly we see again the re-inhabitation of the earth by these warrior classes and city-states. We see this in the very provocative and interesting genealogy in Genesis 10, where these names, this is a genealogy of empire, Babel and Uruk and Akkad and Assyria and Nineveh and the great city. These are all euphemisms for the empires of antiquity. So all of this is what leads us up to the story of Babel, which is the great accomplishment of Nimrod, the great hunter, the predatory culture of imperial urbanism. Now, that's the seventh and final descent into madness that is narrated in Genesis 1 to 11. And it is the culmination, or what we might call the nadir, of the human unraveling, the human disintegration, the human defiance of the polycultural architecture of life, and forming it more and more into the monoculture of empire. If you're interested in reading a bit more of this very brief summary of Genesis 1 to 11 as the fall from garden to tower, you can look at my chapter in this book, which many of you know, Buffalo Shout, Salmon Cry. Look at the way in which this final stage of the fall is narrated. The whole earth had one language and the same words. And people migrated from the east and came upon a plain of Shinar and settled there. So this is now a story of the concentration of human population and the sort of enforced cultural conformity. So you see the final unraveling of original polyculture into this project that is narrated in this old folk tale. The next thing you get in the Babel story is the building of this tower, the architecture of domination. Come, let us make bricks, burn them thoroughly. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves so that we will not be scattered abroad. Now, the original creation trope of Genesis 1 and 2 is that human beings will scatter and flourish, will live biodiversely and polyculturally all around throughout creation. Now you see the human attempt to reverse that architecture. In fact, it's narrated as a very intentional defiance of the divine plan. This business of burning bricks and building cities, obviously coming from a Hebrew cosmology where these are people who knew what it was like to have to work as slave laborers, building the great cities of the Egyptian Empire as narrated in the Exodus. So this is these are poignant stories which arose directly out of the historical experience of the Hebrew people. This is why we see in the Hebrew Bible a very strong strand of antipathy toward the imperial vertical architecture of domination. So Isaiah, you have said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars. That's a trope from the Tower of Babel, but in Isaiah 14 it refers to the king of Babylon. Similarly in Jeremiah 51, even if Babylon reaches the sky and fortifies her lofty stronghold, I will send destroyers against her. So you have this subtext throughout the Hebrew scriptures, particularly in the prophets, in which the great urban projects of ancient empire earned only the wrath of Yahweh and the antipathy of the people of Yahweh, which of course is exactly the opposite of how we lionize them in Western history. Here comes the funny part of the Tower of Babel story. There's the humorous part. The people are trying to build a tower up to the heavens, but the deity has to come down to see what all the fuss is about. So that's meant to be kind of sardonic humor. And the decision of the divine court is, look, they are one people, one language, and that is only the beginning. Nothing they propose will be impossible now. So let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So Creator scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, so that they left off building the city. So this is the lesson of this ancient tale. Empire is centripetal. It pulls everything into itself. Natural resources, human labor, wealth, destroying polyculture, building up monoculture into this concentrated social project. If empire is centripetal, then the only response of resistance has to be centrifugal, meaning fleeing, going to the margins. And that really introduces the theme that dominates the rest of the scriptural story, as we'll see in a minute. Here's the punchline in the story. Therefore, the place was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth and scattered them abroad. So this Hebrew word is a play on words. Babel means the gate of the gods, and you're seeing pictures of ancient ziggurats. The Tower of Babel story was a parody of ancient ziggurat culture, which was universal around Mesopotamia, and so momentous on the landscape that you can still see the ruins of these artificial mountains in places like Untash. At the top of these ziggurats was the gate in which the king communed with the gods, the Babel. And so this place is called Babel, a parody on Babel, but also using the Hebrew term Balal. In other words, these people who build these towers, they're deeply confused about what it means to be human. And so this project needs to be deconstructed through a centrifugal counterforce or strategy. Again, this is a theme that runs throughout our scriptures. We see it in Ezekiel 31. Thus says God, because it towered high and set its top among the clouds, and its heart was proud of its height, I will give it into the hands of the prince of the nations, who will deal with it as its wickedness and deserves. So throughout the prophets are dreaming of the demise of this centripetal imperial narrative. On the heels of the Tower of Babel story begins the second counter-narrative of redemption. The first one was Noah's Ark. The second one is the call to Abram, which picks right up in Genesis 12, and that's where God calls Abram to leave the imperial city of Haran and go to the wilderness of Canaan, where he begins rebuilding the human experiment and gets a great revelation under the oak of Moreh. This, therefore, is the story of the Hebrew Bible. From then on, it's all about centrifugal resistance to centripetal empire, most dramatically, obviously, illustrated in the story of the Exodus, where there is a huge walkout from empire back into the wilderness, and there again, Creator begins the process of trying to reconstruct human life on the basis of things like Sabbath economics and tribal diversity and local sustainable culture. So that the Bible has at best an ambivalent and at worst an antipathetic perspective on the imperial city. From the Bible's point of view, it was all about kicking out or marginalizing local cultures, and making all human and natural resources serve the interests of the city. This then brings us to the second part of the story, which is the story of Pentecost. And Pentecost, interestingly, recontextualizes and resonates with many of these themes. And I'll very quickly just run through this because we've just celebrated the Feast of Pentecost. It is the feast on which Christians celebrate the birth of the church, and I want you to see that as just another iteration in the biblical narrative of God trying to reboot human culture in a more diverse way in the face of imperial monoculture. When the day of Pentecost was being fulfilled is the way that Luke starts this narrative in Acts 2. This is alluding to the fact that Pentecost is the feast of Shavuot, which is the harvest festival of the traditional Hebrew calendar. It was a 50-day festival, hence the name Pentecost, meaning 50. That's why Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, falls 50 days after Easter or Passover. Shavuot is the symbolism of 7 times 7, which are Jubilee kinds of numbers, Sabbath economics kind of numbers. It was a festival of redistributing the harvest wealth to the people. In the book of Acts, this Shavuot vision is being fulfilled by two forms of redistributed power. In the first 13 verses, it's the power of the tongue, and in the last part of Acts, it's the redistribution of the community's goods. We won't go into this in great detail, but here you see that the word in Greek is diamerizomai. The tongues were distributed or divided among them. And at the end of Acts 2, that same verse is used to distribute possessions. So Pentecost in the first instance, whatever else tongues have meant in Christian history, in its original context was about nothing more and nothing less than the redistribution of cultural and socioeconomic power. And that was done right at the heart of the Romanized imperial city of Jerusalem, as it's narrated in Acts 2. The Spirit comes down, as you recall the story, and the tongues are distributed. These glossae enables all of those gathered in this upper room to begin to speak other languages as the Spirit gave them declaration. So at least in this first instance, people aren't speaking a strange language, they're speaking foreign tongues. Why is that? Well, it's because Jews were gathered from every nation under heaven, right? In this archetypal tale, all the tribal groups are gathered in the metropolitan, cosmopolitan city of Jerusalem, and they're all speaking different languages. But in this Pentecost moment, they hear the disciples speaking the good news to them in their own native tongue. Now, there was a perfectly good lingua franca in first century Romanized Jerusalem, and that was the imperial language of Greek in the Eastern Empire. But that's not the universalizing language being used here. Rather, everybody's hearing it in their own tongue, their own little tribal, local language. And that confuses them, that they're hearing this in their own tongue. Now, that's another connection to the Babel story, because remember how confused the Babelites were. These metropolitan Jerusalemites similarly are confused because, once again, monoculture is being fractured back into a healthy polyculture. They're particularly amazed because the people doing this are uneducated rural Galileans. How do they know suddenly how to be polyglot? They haven't attended the finest Roman linguistic schools. And how is it that each of us hears in our own native language? And then comes a long list of all the different tribal groups and national groups from east, north, south, and west who had gathered, all hearing about the good news. So what we see in the Pentecost story is the Babel story reiterated, Babel 2.0, where once again the problem is imperial monoculture and the oppression that surrounds it. And once again, the divine initiative is to rehabilitate polyculture as resistance. And this is being done right at the heart of domination. And the story finishes, everyone was amazed, wondering, what does this mean? Well, that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time. What do these old stories mean? And what do they mean here in our world? A world which obviously is locked down by so many different forms of imperial monoculture. Whether it's fast food, globalized fast food, globalized instant media, globalized workplaces, we are all victims of an ever broadening and deepening monoculture. But what we really want to look at today is what does this mean, particularly in terms of agriculture? How has the way that we grow and procure and consume food, how has it been deformed by monoculture? And what might be polycultural strategies of resistance? And I'm really, really pleased to welcome our two friends, and I'm going to invite Erynn, if you'd come up here and recenter the camera so everybody can see Erynn Smith. And I'm also going to now change screens so you can see Erynn a bit better. Thank you for being here, Erynn. I really appreciate you coming all the way down the street.
Yep, a 30-minute bike ride.
Erynn, you're a local. You're a native to Ventura County, and your family's a farming family. Tell us just a little bit about growing up in the Oxnard Plain and what you saw in terms of agriculture.
Sure. So I am a fifth-generation farmer. My great-great-grandfather immigrated from Germany, benefited from the Mexican land acts, was able to get land very cheaply because it was taken from the Mexican rancheros, grew beets, lima beans, and my great-grandfather's generation grew avocados, and then my grandmother's generation, all of that land was sold for development. So I grew up with a whole lot of stories, right, around our dinner table about agriculture, about farming, but I never had any personal experience directly, right, with the field. So my experience was, I think, much like everyone I grew up with experience, right? We were surrounded by strawberry fields. Oxnard is the largest producer of strawberries in the county. I think we're the third largest in the state. The state of California is the largest producer of strawberries in the country. So, visiting my grandparents and my cousins in Oxnard, I drove, through the strawberry fields. I played in strawberry soccer tournaments. My family went to the strawberry festival. But the strawberry itself was ubiquitous. The fields were ubiquitous, but completely disconnected from that image were those strawberry workers, or understanding, having any knowledge of what went on in growing those strawberries. So lots of stories about farming, lots of stories. I mean, the reality is my family economically benefited from owning land and from farming and from generational land ownership. But no, in my generation, no experience with agriculture, and just kind of seeing agriculture in its very disconnected form.
And you had something of a journey through other cultures on your way to deciding to become a farmer right back in your home place. Say a little bit about that.
Right. So I, in 2005, 2006, lived in Ecuador. And while I was living in Ecuador, I was a part of a very localized food system that had been relatively unchanged for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And, where growing up in Ventura County, you went to the grocery store to buy your produce, and the produce came from all around the world. Anything was available whenever. It was that very kind of consumer-centered way of accessing and eating. In Ecuador, you went to the farmer's market. It wasn't a weekend thing. It was where every neighborhood had a farmer's market. It was every day, year round, and the farmers were there selling their produce. So you knew what was in season because it was you could buy a big bag of plums when it was plum season, a big bag of avocados when it was avocado season. So what we ate was so shaped and directed by what was in season and grown locally. Also, while I was there, they were kind of negotiating comercio libre, the free trade with the United States, and there was a lot of outcry, a lot of protesting, and just observing and participating as a witness in those heated conversations. I learned so much about my own culture, my own economy in a way that cast a really, negative, or for me, it was hurtful to learn about that's where I learned about Monsanto. That's where I learned about the kind of damaging agricultural practices, economic practices that this country, especially the farming, kind of the indigenous farmer populations, were very much against. So, after my 2 years there coming back, it really kind of reoriented or reframed my relationship with agriculture and my relationship with kind of agricultural economies.
So from the perspective of what we've just talked about in this catechism of Babel and Pentecost, really your time in Ecuador introduced you to different culture and society, different language where you had to inhabit and exist in another language, and also a different food system. And so that was in a sense your own deconstructing of your Babel formation, like all of us get in this country. How did you find your way to the Abundant Table Farm?
So in 2007, I was back in Ventura County getting a teaching credential, and I was really interested in food justice, looking at food systems, looking at food production, distribution, access, labor. And as I'm at Cal State Channel Islands, our local university, getting a teaching credential, I connect with Sarah Nolan, who was the chaplain, kind of program coordinator for the Abundant Table at that time. Sarah Nolan is and had been a part of the South Central Farmers Cooperative, which was the struggle based out of Los Angeles, a large garden that was taken over by the city. Those gardeners were moved off of their plot where they had been growing for themselves in their community. They had organized to begin a farm. So Sarah was a part of that struggle and was a part of kind of forming that farm. So she was very much, and the Abundant Table was very much looking at food in our Ventura County community. So I was hungry to kind of look and understand about agriculture in a way that in a way that wasn't being talked about in my family or largely in the educational system. So yeah, Sarah Nolan and the Abundant Table was a place where I could ask questions about what was going on in our own local food production, in labor, and that kind of guided that guided the Abundant Table. I guess I should talk a little bit about the Abundant Table.
Yeah, say a little bit about what you all have struggled to do for the last 5 or 6 years.
Right. So the Abundant Table really started as a campus ministry at Cal State Channel Islands, but was kind of in a progressive, inclusive Christian tradition, and we kind of staked our claim in agriculture because how we grow food, how food is distributed, how food is accessed, really kind of hits on all of a lot of justice pieces. So, in looking at food justice in our community, it became very clear that there wasn't just food being practiced in our community. And if we were going to talk a lot about what wasn't just, what were we doing to be justice in our place? So in 2007, 2008, we started the Abundant Table Farm Project. that was 5 acres of organic farm, and we started an internship program and began farming those 5 acres and growing produce in a sustainable organic way to feed our community through community-supported agriculture, which then kind of evolved into growing for our local farm to school, a couple school districts in our community, which is what we continue today.
And what is your role? You've played several different roles. Maybe you can resume some of the different roles from field to school classroom.
Sure. So I was a student at CSUCI, interested in food justice, thrilled to be a part of a faith community that was looking at justice through a faith lens, which had not been my Catholic experience growing up. And when Sarah and our community were ready to start the farm, they asked if I wanted to be an intern. And it felt right. And it felt like I could be a part of starting this farm, and I could also grow educational programs, because I think I feel really strongly from my own experience, no one, that's kind of dominant culture, right? Like, it's just what you do, how you know the dominant narratives, and wanted to be a part of diversifying the narrative through education that is connected to land, connected to growing food. So we were able to start a farm that first year. I was an intern with 4 other amazing women. The second and third year I stayed on as more of kind of a farm manager position, also continued to do farm education. In our third year, we hired our current farm manager, Erynn Ortega, who had over a decade of experience working in monocultural, conventional, industrial agriculture. And from her experience with really efficient harvesting, efficient packing, efficient, she made everything a lot more efficient. The farm, she was able to take over the farm management, and I was able to focus more on farm education.
Now, the Babel and Table has worked 2 different plots of land over its tenure. I think 3 acres and 5 acres, something like that, in 2 different parts of the Oxnard broader plain. In both cases, both plots have been surrounded by industrial monocropping, and yet you all try to do a fairly diverse market garden. Talk a little bit about how you all curate that polycultures, how you decide what to grow, what kind of diversity, how you've been experimenting, because it has been an experiment, within the constraints of operating a community-supported agriculture operation that has economic pressures to produce. And so it's not like this is a hobby, this is actually a business that you're doing. So say a little bit about your own polycultural practices as they've evolved.
Right, that's been probably and this speaks to kind of the root of Empire. How do we practice what we believe and live what we believe in a way where we're also able to financially take care of ourselves? Because we are practicing our farm business with a diversified community that can't access degrees to fall back on, or right, like Raina and her family, if the farm doesn't work, they go back to conventional industrial agriculture. So that has been a huge pressure and a huge source of motivation and inspiration. So community supported agriculture, where you join the farm at the beginning of the season, that's kind of the pure model. You join the farm at the beginning of the season, you pay upfront what it costs to grow for a season. That model has not worked for us. We live in a community that is, I would say, not particularly all on the same page when it comes to understanding impacts of industrial agriculture, and when it comes to the cost of actually growing sustainably. There's a lack of understanding or a financial reality that can't actually do that. So that has been our challenge. Like, how can we continue practicing sustainable agriculture in a way where we're also making our produce accessible to who we want to be feeding, which is anyone who wants to be consuming our produce in our community. So here's some of the ways that we've been able to balance kind of business management with also access in our community. So we're not going to compromise on sustainable soil care. Kids come out to the farm, and the first thing I ask them, what's the most important thing a farmer does? And they say, grow food for the community. No, it's feeding our soil, right? Growing our soil. So we practice cover cropping, tons of compost that we're spreading every season. We do manure cover cropping. That builds fertility and life in the soil, and then that life grows in our produce. We have 100 or so members CSA. The way that we've kind of adapted our CSA is so instead of actually having to purchase an upfront season, we're able to offer 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. So that kind of lets folks pay less upfront. That's kind of helped us to maintain a regular CSA. We also found that our local farm to school has been critical in sustaining our farm, because we're able to work with school districts who have food purchasing budgets. And we've got a couple school districts who are really open into working creatively with their budgets to be able to spend more on local produce. So we're able to sell at a price of what it actually costs us to grow. So our produce is going into local cafeterias, and most of the kids who are eating lunch in the cafeteria from the kitchens in the cafeteria are part of the free and reduced lunch program. So most likely coming from homes where local organic food might not be an economic possibility. So yeah, we do the organic sustainable soil care. We practice integrated pest management. So that means every couple of rows we're planting flower or herbal hedges. Those flowers or herbs attract beneficial insects, which eat the pests that could eat our crops, or they're producing such a lovely strong smell that it repels the bugs and keeps them from consuming our produce. Or we have some crops that are a bit bug damaged, and then we just write in our newsletter to our CSA subscribers, this is why you've got some holes in your bok choy, because we're not using synthetic pesticides, and this is what an organic bok choy looks like. It's got some holes. It is in fact holy.
Holy bok choy.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think that's a part of that's kind of counter to the conventional industrial food system, where there's got to be multiple links in the chain from the farm to the consumer, so that those links in between really control the ideas about what should be consumed and the ideas about what it should look like. When you've got that direct relationship with the farmer, it's so much more relational to what the land can do and to what the farmer believes is responsible in caring for that land. And all of our subscribers really believe in that and want to be a part of supporting responsible land care.
One of our collaborators and friends is Brent Wass. He's an Episcopal church up in Oregon, Eugene, I think. He's also a small-scale farmer, and he wrote recently that when a federal government agent began a class on pastured poultry, the teacher began with the phrase, "You can't feed the world with backyard chickens." Right. And Brent Wass responded, "Well, actually, we cannot possibly feed the world with anything but backyard chickens if we have plans on surviving as a species that relies on agriculture for another 40 centuries. The vast economies of scale of industrial agriculture has compromised virtually every component of the path of least resistance, let alone a sacramental experience of the creation, perhaps most destructively by putting the responsibility for agriculture into the hands of 2% of the population." So he's arguing that actually we need to expand the number of people involved in agriculture to 20 to 30%. We need more backyard chickens and local community gardens if we are really going to solve not only the food crisis, but the cultural crisis. The narrative that you are telling is a narrative of an exodus from monoculture to rediscovering not only new ways to grow food, but new ways to be human. And I love the way that you tell this story with and about Reina Ortega, both of you roughly the same age, coming from vastly different ends of the social spectrum, her in Mexico, you in Ventura County, and yet both of you have joined forces, her in exodus from working the industrial celery fields, and you in Exodus from your privileged upbringing in Ventura, and now you're working together. It really is an Exodus story. Do you think it's replicable? It's been a struggle for you guys. Can more and more people do this? Is this really part of the solution?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's one of the places where I get most frustrated is that Shiva, her first name,
Vandana Shiva.
yeah, was talking about like the first step is to dismiss, right? To dismiss the story of diversified, sustainable, local, traditional, and I really feel that in how kind of the agricultural power structures have responded to us as a farm and as an organization. Our farm is currently, after moving off of our first plot, we're now leasing land from our local ag extension. And the director of that agricultural extension said that organic agriculture is the equivalent of backyard gardening, and it can't possibly feed the world. And my response to that is, 3 out of 4 farm workers in Oxnard are food insecure. So the dominant model isn't even feeding the labor force that drives that model. So how can we talk about an agricultural model feeding the world when that model doesn't even take care of people in our community who are growing and tending and cultivating that food? So I think that we are dismissed because we are a farm. Our full-time staff is between 4 and 5. We are 5 acres. We have, our revenues are a very small drop in the bucket to what the, millions of dollars that, the industrial model is bringing into our, billions of dollars that the industrial model is bringing in. But until that model can, and the number one reason why those 3 out of 4 farm workers reported food insecurity was because of low wages. So until that model can provide enough income for farm workers to have a healthy food source, I think that we've got to be, that paradigm is bullshit, right? And it's crazy to me how steeped that power structure is in that paradigm that turns a total blind eye to what's actually going on in our community. And I am really proud to be a part of something that is actually creating that kind of security, food security and land security. So can it be replicated? I think so, but I think it really has to be done in the context of place.
Yeah, and of course, it is demonstration projects like the Abundant Table Farm that animate the imagination of what is possible. And that gets back to something you mentioned earlier. Not only are you doing polycultural agriculture, but you're also diversifying the story of what is possible. And you're diversifying that story with people and with young kids in the public schools in Ventura County. So just say a word about your role in the classroom as someone interpreting an alternative vision. You are you and the other people in the Abundant Table are the Vandana Shivas of Ventura County. How are you communicating that passion, the critique, but also the alternative?
Right, so at the Abundant Table on our farm, we're seeing thousands of kids every year coming through our farm, or we're going into the classrooms through a program called Farmer in the Classroom, where we're talking about how we're growing. We're talking about the way that we care for soil, the way that we care for our health, your family's health, the earth's health. And that kind of in and of itself encourages a critical reflection or understanding of the agriculture that surrounds us, because our farm looks very different than the monocultural strawberry farms. So we can begin to crack open conversation about the practices that are used in monoculture versus the practices that are used on our farm and what impacts that has. So that even just begins to awaken a sense of what's actually going on in those fields. I'd be remiss not to mention Elise Eckel, who is in the room.
Come on over here and put your head in the camera, Elise, so people can see you. This is informal June. Come on.
Yeah. So the Ventura County Farm to School Collaborative.
This is Elise Eckel. Say hi.
Hello.
She's being shy.
So she is the project coordinator for the Healthy Schools project at Ventura Unified School District. She's been there, ever since after her intern year at the Abundant Table. How many years now?
So it's been 4 years with Ventura.
4 years.
4 years. And she essentially kind of coordinates their farm to school program, which is procuring locally grown fruits and vegetables for their food service, but also coordinating the educational programs that connect kids with how that food is grown and who grows it and all of the parts involved in that. So it's really about drawing relationships in the schools, in school gardens, in the cafeteria, and on local farms, in the classes, kind of connecting kids with connecting the dots that are the dominant culture is not connecting. And so, I mean, literally thousands of kids at Ventura Unified, and now there's a farm to school collaborative that's 6 different school districts. So now we're in farm worker school districts, and 6 out of, I think there's 20 school districts in the county, which is a huge first step. And the goal is to bring all of those districts into the collaborative so that every student in Ventura County's public schools is consuming locally grown produce that's purchased in a way that is supportive of local farmers and local agriculture, is getting the educational supports to know exactly what that is and how it was grown and why it's beneficial to consume that. And that builds kind of lifelong, healthy local consumers.
Erynn, it is my deepest conviction that what you all are trying to do, struggling to do, imperfectly, with limited success, and yet heroically, in my opinion, is nothing less than re-narrating these old stories of Exodus from monoculture through your personal biographies, through the way you're changing how you move through social and political and economic space. And in doing that, you are finding your soul and finding a more robust faith. And that's, I believe, what these old scriptural stories are inviting us to do. Before you turn it over to Eric, do you have one story from either the field or the classroom that comes to mind that just kind of sticks in your heart? I know you got a million of them. Anyone come to mind?
I guess. Yeah. So we were out in the field, and a lot of the kids who have a hard time in the classroom, because classroom environments are set up for, you're sitting on your desk, you're kind of confined all day. So I get a lot of comments from teachers and from students that the kids who have a hard time in the classroom really thrive on the farm, because the farm is so interactive and it's so experiential and it's so outdoors and there's so many kind of moving pieces. So a teacher, before a field trip, gave me a heads up that this particular student had a lot of behavior issues, and here's the things that she did, and halfway through that field trip, that there was a hawk that was circling over, and I was sharing a story about how, we were talking about how hawks are really beneficial because they eat, the pests, the rodents that eat our vegetables. And that kid just stopped and threw his hands in the air, and he's like, "This is the best day of my life." And so that farm was a place where that kid felt so connected, right, to his place and to the animals in his ecosystem, and to getting to be a part of weeding and caring for soil and harvesting. That is it. It's all of our best days of our lives.
Thank you, Reverend. That's beautiful. Thank you, Erynn. We've got a little live audience here in the sweltering BCM studio. I want to welcome Eric. Eric Humel is another neighbor, and really delighted to have you here, Eric. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
First of all, introduce yourself. Say just a little bit about yourself and how you came to Ventura County.
Well, I guess I got interested in gardening, and I went up to Northern California and heard about some guy, Masanobu Fukuoka, and natural farming, and heard about permaculture back in 1999 or so, and started just looking into all that and learning as much as I could about it. So I picked that up as my vocational pathway, I guess, and ended up here in Ventura after a bunch of travels and staying in a bunch of places and learning a bunch of stuff. And started putting all my skills to work for the young people in Oxnard. A lot of the children of some of the farm workers that Erynn was talking about, and other people kind of a lower income area, and working with the youth in a garden program,
Mhm.
garden project.
We'll talk more about Community Roots Garden in a minute. Erynn talked about Ecuador as sort of symbolizing the chapter where she really started to break with how she'd been formed, as all of us are, in sort of a monocultural mode. Are there moments in your journey that sort of were that for you, that you can look back and say, wow, that was really that's where I started turning the corner or had my mind blown?
I guess it maybe comes down to just seeing the systems that are really healthy ecologically and diverse and really have a lot of relationships going on behind them, and animals and plants and people and families. And I think just seeing that and being like, wow, this is a much different way than what I'd seen in South Orange County where I'd grown up.
Oh, you're another Californian, huh?
Yeah,
Another Californian
suburban
in
sprawl.
exodus from suburbia. So what was one of those places that you saw and you just said, wow, this is what it could be?
It's probably one of the farms up in Humboldt County
Mhm.
that I stayed at or interned at. Especially, this one guy's place was way out in the boonies, middle of nowhere, and he was just kind of a legend seed grower, just known for kind of maintaining a lot of rare varieties. And he had a tiny little seed company. He was living in poverty, but the mission he had to really conserve these varieties and grow out all different kinds of stuff, and really modeling his system really after Masanobu Fukuoka and having that really natural farming ethic. I think that was probably it. Staying there for a couple months, walking to get my water, and it was pretty out there.
Fukuoka was the one who said, if you throw Mother Nature out the window, she'll come back in the door with a pitchfork, right?
Yeah.
Talk for a minute about seeds, since you mentioned this in Humboldt. I thought you were going to maybe talk about the other main crop in Humboldt. We'll leave that alone. Talk about seed diversity and why that is important, and why seed saving and heirloom seed, as opposed to, why shouldn't we re-engineer food for seeds for higher crop yield and pest resistance?
Okay, so yeah, I guess crossing plants together, creating hybrids, it's been done forever, and there is some benefits to that, but a lot of times it ends up in real kind of narrow gene pools for specific traits, especially developed for real monocropped, agribusiness, international environments. Whereas open pollinated or the kind of more heirloom seeds definitely have a lot more diverse genetics, usually.
Folks might not understand the term open pollinated. Could you define that for folk?
All right, so just plants that reproduce normally, from the pollen crossing from one plant to the other, rather than a human coming in and crossing this specific variety, say this big fat tomato, crossing it with this green tomato, and then ending up with this hybrid, which they definitely have some hybrid vigor. There's some vigor there that usually manifests, but other than that, they kind of, once they get bred too specifically down to like serving just yield, that's where you kind of lose a lot of the stability or resilience or resistance
of that particular variety.
That might have been in there, yeah.
Right. So why is heirloom seed and open pollinated seed so important? Are these things in danger today?
I would say so, yeah. I think there's been a lot of loss of varieties, especially the last 10, 20 years, with seed companies disappearing or merging or being bought up, all that kind of thing. So, and then these varieties, they're the ones that were really bred to be real stable. Like if you talk to corn farmers down in Mexico, like growing traditional varieties, the variety that often they prefer is real, maybe one that doesn't have the highest yield in a particular year, or but it might have a more stable yield just
In the long
constantly.
term.
Maybe there's a real bad drought,
Yeah.
you still get some corn from that variety.
So that's the wisdom that's really learned and earned over the long arc. And so much of GMO and seed engineering is really about short-term profit and short-term yield.
Yeah, and really reliant on inputs.
Yeah.
A lot of energy, fossil fuels go into the production of those varieties.
I want to switch to one slide, get to it, and have you just comment on this. This will be something you're pretty familiar with, about some of the differences between modern agriculture and nature. A lot of what the kind of growing that you do is really trying to move more to the right side of this chart. Can you just say a little bit about some of these aspects of agriculture versus how things work in nature?
Okay, so yes, modeling a production system after nature, I think definitely has some wisdom to it. Looking at the cycles that are inherent, the nutrient cycles, all that, rather than the system like a really simple, straightforward agriculture, kind of like the picture you had earlier where it was just row crops next to that guy's system that looked really chaotic. And actually, ecologically speaking, which is what this is talking about here, like looking at these systems ecologically, the system on the left, that was that guy's really wild garden, that's actually much more ordered, stable, resilient, whereas the system on the right, which was just the row crops or the bare soil, was not resilient at all. It depended on just huge amounts of inputs, energy, fossil fuels, chemicals, all that.
Now, this some of these concerns took you into the realm of learning permaculture. Say a little bit about your journey into permaculture and getting your training.
Yeah, I guess I just saw at the community college. No, it was at Humboldt State. I was at a state college. They had a permaculture class, so I took that one semester, and then went and did one of the design courses a few years after that, which is a crucial experience. I think just being in community for 2 weeks with a bunch of folks, learning about how to really live in community with the earth and with other humans and with all the different other species. I think it was a great kind of like transition too. You come out of that and you're like, wow, you think you're pretty changed.
So
See things in a different way.
Yeah, so you've gotten your permaculture design certificate and have been applying that and experimenting with that in lots of different venues, one of which took you to the Abundant Table Farm. And you met one of the farmers there. How did that work out?
Oh, yeah, it worked out good, yeah. Great experience.
Eric met Elise at the Abundant Table, and they eventually got married in a beautiful community ceremony, and now they're have joined their considerable talents together, and we're so fortunate to have you all in the community here. It also, your journey took you to Community Roots Garden in Oxnard. Could you tell us a little bit about how that place started and what the vision was for that? Because that's a pretty interesting story of exodus from monoculture.
Okay, so yeah, it's a garden. It's a 1 acre bare plot that was sitting at a Methodist church in Oxnard. And one woman actually had a dream one night and was like, wow, we should really be using this as a garden because people are coming to us. We had to end our program that was giving out vegetables to low-income folks and other food to low-income folks. And so she had a dream like, why don't we try to produce as much as we can to help distribute it to those who need it, and also allow a place for people to come at the same time and really experience working in community with other folks, growing this food and providing it to the Rescue Mission, which is an organization that serves meals, lots of meals to homeless people in the area. So they started to do that. Instead of doing a community garden, like a normal community garden with individual plots, they went along and went a communal style. So meaning that the whole place is everyone's, and there's kind of organization around that. People come together. Okay, what should we plant over here? What should we plant over here? Let's grow a whole bunch of watermelons, or let's grow a whole bunch of butternut squash, stuff like that. That we can be really feeding a lot of people with, and also allowing people to grow their traditional varieties. If someone comes from Vietnam or someone comes from the Philippines and wants to grow some different kind of vegetable, it's open for that as well.
And a lot of the participants at that community garden are in fact themselves farm workers or related to farm workers, is that right?
Yeah, especially there was a big group of Mixteco that would come out, especially in the beginning, and grow a lot of their traditional herbs, things I'd never heard about, but interesting spices and flavors to add to food.
So this church really repurposed this acre of land into this community garden. And how long has it been going for? And what is your role these days at Community Roots Garden?
It's been around 6 years now. My role, I've been just working with young people, especially on the weekends, kids who are on probation and have to do community service hours, come out there and we work with them in the garden, sharing with them all of our knowledge. All the different volunteers get to share their knowledge and experiences and perspective on food and agriculture and life and careers and vocation and anything like that. So it's a real diverse kind of complex experience for a lot of the kids who are just not knowing what to do with their lives, getting in trouble, in gangs, that kind of thing. So we do that every Saturday, and the kids get to harvest some vegetables and food and prepare a meal, and then we all sit down and eat together. So I think that's a really powerful element of it, to share a meal with all different kinds of folks, including kids who are in trouble.
So there's, at Community Roots, there's polyculture going on among the people inhabiting the space. There's lots of polyculture going on in terms of what's planted there and what's being grown there. There's also sort of a polycultural reality underneath the soil, in the food soil web, that a lot of us who are amateurs, we don't see it and we don't appreciate it. Can you talk, as a permaculturist particularly, a little bit about how important the subsurface complexity is for the health of the whole?
Yeah, I think Erynn touched on that a little bit, talking about the health of the soil being the most important element. And I would say, yeah, it's definitely the place to focus. And it's not just the diversity of species or bacteria or fungi or flagellates or whatever are down in there in the soil, but it's also the complexity and the relationships, between that, which makes up the soil food web, how everything's relating together and able to really create a healthy environment, as the bacteria get eaten up by the ciliates or whatever, and then the nutrients from that bacteria is getting released into the soil, and so you don't really have to use any chemicals or things like that, just really creating a healthy, really biologically active, super alive soil that just has all kind of interactions and relationships in it, that's creating really strong fertility.
So we're beginning to see something of a third agricultural revolution. If traditional agriculture, peasant agriculture, was the first, modern industrial agriculture was the second, typified by the metal plow that was about breaking the soil and turning it up and over. That was for a long time considered the conventional wisdom. Now there's a new revolutionary thought that is talking about keeping the soil more intact because of this intricate web. Can you talk a little bit about no-till gardening and agriculture and how you see that as a permaculturist?
I guess it has to do with so much of the biological activity of the soil being right in the top. And so if you're going through and just plowing it all up and mixing it all up and really destroying the really crumbly little structure of your soil particles. It's not really the best thing to do. You don't really want to be burying all your really highly biologically active diversity like a foot or two down, you know. So that's why a lot of people are promoting no-till. I think it gets to really growing things that are maybe a little longer term, so you're not growing these plants that are adapted to having a highly disturbed soil. Like, you know, a lot of the vegetables that we do like to eat and grow are there's certain kind of plants that really like a highly disturbed site, like as if a tornado came through and destroyed everything. What's going to sprout? You know, it's going to be the real kind of quick growing things, you know. But really promoting an environment where maybe we're focusing more on perennials or things that aren't really so reliant on so much high additions of nitrogen, you know, or like trying to get a huge head of cauliflower out of the soil. You know, it takes a lot of nutrients and health in your soil, and maybe it's not really worth it. Maybe you should put your energy into growing something that's more stable and less needy. I don't know. Not to say that I don't like cauliflower, but
but adapting some of our appetites and habits to the conditions of the local area.
Yeah, and how much energy we really think we should put into it.
Right. You are growing food down at Community Roots. Are you growing food in your backyard?
Yeah.
What's growing, and what are you experimenting with in that little plot?
Just, you know, trying to create the highest fertility without bringing anything in is always the goal. So just cover cropping. Last year we tried to cover crop and grow fruit at the same time, and we got a bunch of little lettuces, but I think we learned that maybe we should just say, okay, we're just not going to grow anything here. We're going to just cover crop. So that was kind of a fun little thing to try, because you know, wasn't sure how that would go. I think we grew a little too much cover crop and not enough, so there's too much shade. But
You and I both have some family roots in Orange County, and Orange County is a place that sociologically and agriculturally has been turned into a giant monocrop of housing developments and shopping malls, replacing traditional ranching, and so you have really been on an exodus toward a polycultural reality in your own discipline as a permaculturist, in your own work at Community Roots. Just like Erynn got to tell a story, any story come to mind of some of the kids you work with at Community Roots that you can relate, that can capture some of what you're trying to be about?
Yeah, maybe about creating relationships. I remember one time there was a homie. He was probably in a gang. He was probably like 16, 17, and you know, they kind of give you a lot of attitude when they first meet you, like, who the heck is this guy? Like, he wants to talk to us and make us work here at this garden, and what the heck is this place? Like, we're gonna get all dirty. And then, I don't know, one time, you know, just after talking with him and working alongside him for a number of weekends or whatever, one time I was like, just gave him a project to do, and was like, okay, I gotta go help out with something over here. And I just turned around and walked away, not knowing if he was gonna just like hang out or text on his phone or just stand around and look around like often happens. But then I looked back and he was like, right away, he was just like going to work, like hoeing the soil right there, digging up the weeds that were over in that corner. And I was just like, wow. I was really surprised because he was a tough dude. So I guess that speaks to just relationships and, you know, trying to get to know people for who they are as a human.
Thank you very much, Eric, for joining us. Let's give Eric a little. So appreciative to have both Erynn and Eric, our neighbors and very dear colleagues and friends, to join this conversation about how we rebuild and restore and re-inhabit our world based on really divine principles of diversity and polyculture in a historical moment and a geopolitical moment that is truly dominated by ever more uncompromising forms of monoculture. The reason why we revisit this topic every year is because it is at the heart of the struggle to be human, the struggle for social justice, the struggle for ecological sustainability, the struggle for equity, and I'm so appreciative both of the wisdom of the ancient stories and of the wisdom of our young practitioners who are to embody and incarnate this right here in our own county. We're right up against the hour, and I want to ask you as an audience to do a couple of things. One is a very big moment in the overall struggle against monoculture and its historic consequences is going to happen in a couple of days. On Thursday, Pope Francis is going to release his second encyclical, which translated means "Blessed are you, caring for our common home." It will be focusing on the environment and particularly the interlocking ecological crises of climate catastrophe and loss of fertility, and also the deepening divide between rich and poor. All of the early reviews, sneak peeks at this encyclical, suggest that this document could have more impact on the climate debate than the Paris talks will at the end of this year, because we're basically in the middle of political gridlock. And what is needed now is moral imagination and the embracing of a moral imperative. So Francis, who's already on record around issues of social and economic justice and the scandal of 1% of the population owning and controlling more than 80% of the world's wealth, is pushing back, and he's pushing hard. A lot of conservative Catholics are going to be very upset by this, not only because of what it says about climate change, but because of what it says about social justice and wealth equality. It's going to be released online in 5 languages on Thursday. At the formal release will be one of the Pope's closest advisors and the head of the Vatican Social Justice Division, in a Greek Orthodox bishop, and an atheist scientist who is talking about the science of climate change. One of the most impressive things about this upcoming encyclical is that the Pope basically says the science is in, there's no debate, we are in a crisis, we've got to respond. And that's going to have huge ripples, particularly in North America, where climate denial is still somehow sustained in the political discourse. So keep your eyes and ears and hearts open as this encyclical is released, and to listen for the inevitable backlash, but more importantly, the ways in which hopefully it will enliven all of our imaginations, particularly those of us who are already involved in these kinds of issues. I think this will be a good moment. And finally, when we've talked about diversity and multicultural exploration in the past, we always like to have a little test of our cultural literacy. And so your homework as you go away tonight is to, if you don't already know, learn about the festival of Juneteenth. That's coming up on Friday, June 19th. It is a traditional celebration in the African American community. If you don't know about it, then that's your assignment, to look that up and learn this particular tradition of liberation and celebration of exodus and struggle. Our next webinar in July will be I think, a lot of fun. We're going to interview our summer intern, Mauricio Salgado. He's an artist and an organizer and an educator, comes out of the tradition of theater, theater as a means for animating social justice in the tradition of Augusto Boal. And we're really excited to have him and his wife Cindy with us for part of the time. Mauricio will be with us for about 7 weeks. And he's going to be working a little bit with the Abundant Table, we hope, and maybe Community Roots as well. Maybe leading some workshops in Spanish. And he's going to be up here working with us at BCM. So this will be a lovely chance to learn from this very interesting and impressive young man. And I'll be sending out a link to his TEDx Youth Talk that he did about the power of storytelling and theater in animating social imagination. And we're very excited to announce, dear faithful webinar audience, that beginning this fall in September, we are going to offer a new variety of courses, of bundled webinars at both Pace Yourself webinar classes and also some hybrid live recorded courses, meaning a mix of live webinar and recordings that you can explore any number of the key themes of radical discipleship that we try to promote and animate here out of BCM. We've looked at one of them today, a recurring theme, and we're going to hopefully make these. Chris White, always ever faithful in the next room, keeping these recordings going, has been working really hard, and we're going to work together to develop a curriculum that you can use at your own pace or recommend to friends. So that's a new venture for us as we try to broaden and deepen our journey of learning the lessons of Babel and Pentecost, to live into diversity and justice and divine polyculture. So thanks to Erynn and Eric. We really appreciate you stopping by today and here in the hot box of the office. And thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight, wherever you are around North America. As always, we rely on your word of mouth to keep the webinar series going. Thanks for joining us tonight. And as we usually do, we'll keep the chat function going for a little while as you chat your sign-offs. Particularly, you might want to say a word of thanks in the chat box to Eric and Erynn. So thanks, everybody, and bye for tonight.